Right, so the focus of this morning's discussion will be on the fictional case of Jack Torrance, right? Everybody has seen Shining. Everybody has then provided or performed a psychiatric evaluation on the main character of Jack Torrance. And I think we'll start there because I really do think with regard to the topics we want to cover over the course of REDRUM, probably prudent to start with Jack Torrance. I mean, we'll probably have time towards the end of the hour if you want to discuss any other characters in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. So first step, we've all now seen the case and need to begin to formulate our most likely diagnosis. So hypothetically, for people on this call in this lecture who have not seen The Shining, hypothetically, can someone unmute and just provide us what they saw when they focus on Jack Torrance? Please refrain from any medical jargon. Please refrain from any provisional diagnoses. At this point, I think it's best that you just pretend that you're talking to a bunch of high schoolers who want to learn the basics of psychology and psychiatry. So what did you see?
So there's many times when Jack is seen kind of like staring off blankly into space for long periods of time, kind of not in the appropriate context, which seems bizarre.
Absolutely. And I think with regard to the timing of this, and certainly the way this character is introduced in the film, this looks like it's a change from previous functioning. Right? So, and if you've read the book, if you cheated, you know that it is a change from previous functioning because the novel, Stephen King's novel, actually goes back and provides more detail, even further back in his history. That is, even further prior to this family's move to the Overlook. What else did you say?
I feel like you might think about cabin fever, like being socially isolated and how that might make you go bonkers.
The Shining, the film is definitely about cabin fever. Yep.
Now I mean, I have an appreciation for Stephen King, but I'm not a huge Stephen King buff. Is the cabin fever, is that like a recur? Because I'm noticing that with Misery, I'm noticing that with The Shining. Is this a recurring trope?
I don't know if it's as much cabin fever as it is your immediate environment is not what it always appears, right? And I think the switcheroo that is Stephen King is that under that facade, something sinister lurks. And an example of that, yeah, could be an element of cabin fever. So that's the way I kind of would frame that. Mhm.
So some other things that are odd, um, it's very strange because when he first gets into the hotel, there's a lot of like rooms that are like not occupied, and then suddenly they're full of people with a party. That just seems extremely bizarre to me.
Yeah, and again, not to jump ahead, but at some point, perhaps some point soon, this group is going to have to determine what that's all about. And what I mean is not necessarily, again, to begin throwing potential diagnoses, but instead choose a perspective from which you would like to watch and now discuss this film. All right. So, and unfortunately for this group, I'm going to remove choice A from your potential list of choices, in that this group, we're all psychiatrists, is not allowed to view The Shining as a supernatural horror film. While billions of people in most of the world do that, This selected group, unfortunately, is going to have that removed from their list. Any final thoughts with regard to what you found interesting or unusual about the character of Jack Torrance?
Yeah, it also seems like his wife was, at least in the conversation that she was having with him partway through the movie, seems like he's having some issues with sleeping.
All right, agreed. Absolutely agreed. All right, so given these observations as well as other observations we have as a group, if we now polled 99 Rutgers undergraduates to choose either A, The Shining is about a mood anxiety spectrum, or B, a psychotic dissociative spectrum, what do we think the consensus would be among that group, A or B?
B.
Anybody have any concerns with regard to choice A here? I agree. And if choice B, then what single illness does this group choose to work from with regard to beginning to formulate their most likely diagnosis?
Schizophrenia.
Psychotic. Sorry, Zach, didn't mean to overstep.
Yeah, schizophrenia. And again, that should be your first choice all the time. And again, I think that during your CSV, this is the exact way to begin to formulate your thoughts. And the idea of schizophrenia should be applied to any real patient encounter, in as much as we've practiced this application with regard to case formulation of film. Even though you know, and again, this may not apply to The Shining per se, but even when you know that this individual is not afflicted with schizophrenia, I still would strongly encourage you to begin with schizophrenia, because it's just as important for you to use that as a starting point and then begin to discuss why your formulation departs from that single diagnosis, thinking out loud and providing those answers to the individual you're presenting to, and that might be the patient and their family as well. All right, so explaining your thoughts is really important here, understanding how those thoughts begin to formulate, irrespective of your starting point. So arbitrarily, let's always use schizophrenia when we think choice B, psychotic dissociative spectrum. At this point, again, this is to self-check as well as in a formulation class like this, discuss. Demonstrate your knowledge of the DSM. Somebody, a PGY1, provide me the inclusion criteria for schizophrenia.
We'd have to rule out from a substance-induced psychosis.
Inclusion criteria.
Oh, inclusion criteria. Sorry.
You went to my next step. Stop trying to
sorry.
read my mind.
Sorry, I misheard you. The delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, disorganized thoughts, and negative symptoms.
One more.
For greater than 6 months.
Disorganized behavior.
That's it, right? Yeah, disorganized speech and disorganized thoughts are the same thing. Okay. We need 2 of these over a 6-month period. And it must represent a change from previous functioning. So let's start out with the low-hanging fruit. Okay, we need that threshold of 2. Does Jack Torrance reach that threshold? And if so, demonstrate to me in this movie how.
I want to say disorganized speech. When they see the thing that he's writing, he's only writing, I forget what the sentence is, like that. I feel like that is disorganized.
There's like all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy.
Yeah.
I probably would count that towards disorganized behavior.
Okay.
Right, because he typed it, and the horror is, and again, certainly the horror that's expressed on Wendy's face upon that discovery is that that's all he's been doing. at that desk for those many weeks. I would count that towards disorganized behavior. Remember, too, the way the DSM states this is grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior. And I think he has signs of catatonia, too. The previous observation was that he had spells where he was staring off blankly. So I definitely think this disorganized behavior. I think both from a catatonic perspective as well as grossly disorganized, as evidenced by all work and no play, makes Jack a dull boy. Any other diagnostic criteria fulfilled by this character?
He's having conversations with the former caretaker of the hotel, and he's having visual hallucinations as well during the party.
Yeah, I think that if you were a third person and you overheard this, that would be concerning. And I'm just wondering if that would check the box for disorganized speech, because of course there's nobody there. And yes, he does appear to be experiencing perceptual disturbances. So that's a third symptom. And before we go on any further, let's talk a little bit about perceptual disturbances, because they come in two varieties, generally speaking, that you may have to tease away on exams, right? That includes a board certifying exam. Somebody tell me the difference between, let's keep consistent with this film, a visual hallucination and an illusion, since both are perceptual disturbances.
An illusion is a perceptual disturbance in which there's a stimulus already present and you mistake it for a different stimulus. And then a hallucination is where there's no stimulus present and you discern like a positive stimulus.
And I think in this film, Jack is more likely experiencing a visual hallucination than in an illusion, although there probably are some scenes where that gets called into question. Two more signs and symptoms to discuss whether Jack actually meets criteria. Delusions and negative symptoms, right? So do you think Jack is delusional? It seems to me that he has a fixed belief that he has to correct his family. And again, I think by acting on that delusion, we see evidence of even more bizarre and disorganized behavior. I think if any of us, even in our role as a psychiatrist, discussed with Jack that in fact there's no need, there's no reason to do what he's doing, he's likely to remain fixed in that belief. So I'm just wondering if he likely meets criteria for a deficit of thought content that is delusional in capacity. Remember too, what are the two defining characteristics of a delusion, two qualities that differentiate the delusion from any other deficit of thought content?
It's false and it's fixed.
Exactly right. Right. So, and that fixed nature is what we have to focus on here. Now, I don't think his thoughts are ever challenged, so we really don't know. But you know, your presumptive diagnosis here, I think, as a group, probably would lean towards the fact that these thoughts are fixed. So, at least provisionally, it does appear as if Jack Torrance is suffering from delusions. And then finally, he does have scenes where he has a constricted as well as a flat affect. So he does check the box for negative symptoms as well. That said, before we leave this discussion, affect. Somebody tell me the 5 domains of affect, which is a routine part of the mental status exam. When you report on affect, when you present a patient and are reporting on affect per mental status exam findings, what 5 domains do you report on?
One of them is intensity.
It's number 1.
Range.
Yep.
Rate of change, I would say.
Ability.
Good. 3.
Congruence with the mood.
Good. 4. And this group is the easiest one, the type. Right?
Oh.
Right, your favorite adjective describing. Good. All right. So again, I think that there's a flat affect here. I do think there's affective flattening. I think that Jack's intensity is below normal. Matter of fact, it's well below normal. So if the norm is a C, Jack is not a D. He's an F. The D would be, I think, blunted. The F would be flattened, which fits well. All right, so, I mean, we could make the case then that Jack Torrance actually demonstrates all 5 inclusion criteria for schizophrenia. The next step then is our acknowledgement that this condition is a diagnosis of exclusion. So now we need to discuss the 5 illnesses that any clinician has to investigate and rule out in order to continue to work up schizophrenia. What are those 5 conditions?
Autism.
Number 1.
Medical etiology, substance, schizoaffective,
Mood disorder.
mood
5.
disorder
Perfect.
with psychosis.
Right. Yep, there's your 5. So let's start with a substance use disorder as well as a substance-induced psychotic disorder. So the first step here is to evaluate for a substance use disorder. And the first question when we look at or watch to analyze films is whether or not there's overt evidence of a substance use disorder written into the script of the film. Thoughts?
So during the actual time he is there, I'm going to say there is not discrete evidence besides for 1 time or 2 times when he's at the bar, but it's unclear whether that's actually real or not. So I'm going to go with not discrete evidence in the film during the time that he's at the hotel.
And, I think the observation, which actually gets at one of my initial points, is how we choose to watch this film. Is he being served by ghosts, or is what's going on a product of his own mind? Maybe there is alcohol there, and he's in denial, which of course is a very common defense mechanism employed by individuals with addiction. So your observation as to not knowing puts us right back, I think, in position 1 and how we choose to perceive or experience this film. And then number 2, I think it's worth stating too that your observation parallels aspects of real life encounters with real people in that their report may not always be consistent. And especially in addiction medicine, where different things that were told, maybe even different parts of the interview or different parts of the same interview, as well as consecutive interviews, may seem inconsistent, and we have to question the reliability of the individual or the collateral. So again, this observation does have a parallel with regard to interviewing in real time. That said, I want to again rephrase the question. Is there any overt evidence in the script of a substance use disorder? The answer is yes.
The bartender about
I was gonna say, yeah.
drinking again.
Yeah, I think it was like 3 months or something.
Well, that's a
It's
little
been
tricky.
5 months.
Yeah, you're both right because when Wendy talks to the pediatrician, she provides the date of his last use or how sustained the remission is, while Jack, talking to Lloyd, gives us a different timeline. So there's that inconsistency again. So we don't know if this is sustained remission, but the least we can say right now is that Jack does have an established alcohol use disorder. Now, the next question, and this is exactly what Zach was getting to. In what context can psychoses be induced in someone with an established alcohol use disorder? And there's three answers. Let's take them one by one. In what context or how can someone have psychotic symptoms induced via an alcohol use disorder?
Withdrawal.
Definitely. Okay. Is there any evidence that The Shining is a fictional case study of an alcohol-induced psychotic disorder through its withdrawal phase?
No.
I don't see it. I mean, if you watch this movie and you actively watch and you look for signs and symptoms of alcohol withdrawal, I don't see any evidence of tremor. I don't see any evidence that would be published in the DSM as defining withdrawal. So that would be a difficult sell. Give me another scenario in which alcohol may induce psychoses.
Alcohol poisoning? Like if you,
Well, intoxication.
yeah.
So same question. Is The Shining a case study of an alcohol-induced psychotic disorder through intoxication? Probably not. But again, it gets to Zach's point. I don't know what's happening there at that bar. Right. So I think clinically we would obtain a blood alcohol level to see if Jack Torrance actually has alcohol in the system. We don't know. We do know per Ullman that this hotel is dry and all the alcohol has been removed. And he talks about, for liability reasons, but we don't know what Jack may have brought up with him. And it's interesting that in the book, there is an allusion to his packing alcohol in the trunk and moving in. So I would say no, but I'm not quite as comfortable as I am in ruling out alcohol withdrawal. And I think certainly a blood alcohol level would be part of our treatment planning. What is the third and final way that alcohol can induce a psychotic disorder?
Wernicke-Korsakoff.
Yeah, Wernicke-Korsakoff. So, the question then becomes, and this is again mediated by thiamine deficiency. And the question here now is whether or not the disorganized behavior that we see somewhat early in the film is part of a delirium. And then we observe an evolution to the potentially irreversible neurologic sequelae, referred to as Corsocal Psychosis. To define Corsocal Psychosis, the individual will demonstrate amnesia, will confabulate, and will have perceptual disturbances. And the psychosis, perceptual disturbances, is brought upon by that thiamine deficiency, which again initiates or begins with Wernicke's encephalopathy. So that's an interesting take on this film, and I don't know if we can comfortably rule that out. I mean, there does seem to be moments of amnesia, and again, let's reflect back to Jack's self-report with regard to his sustained sobriety. He provides a timeline that is different than Wendy's. Might that be confabulation? And the answer is quite possibly. Now, again, he could be over-lying, But then again, that could be confabulation. So he may not have intact memory. He may actually have amnesia with regard to events from X months prior. That's why he gets the timeline wrong, and that's why he actually confabulates. Now, remember too, I think further evidence to support this is just understanding Stanley Kubrick. He is arguably the most obsessive compulsive producer that has ever existed. The labor that he applies to every single scene in every single movie he has ever produced is legendary. Some actors and actresses have actually had difficulty with regard to depression and anxiety after working with Kubrick, largely due to the intensity and the attention to detail that he required from his cast. And because of that, it's very unlikely that he would have missed the two different timelines provided by Wendy earlier in the movie, and then Jack a little bit later with regard to Jack's sustained sobriety. So there may actually, that actually may be indicative of Jack Torrance confabulating. So something to consider. Bottom line is that we cannot rule out Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome here. So at least now in Axis 1, we have alcohol use disorder. And I think here we would have a substance-induced psychotic disorder rule out Wernicke's-Korsakoff syndrome, or at least Corsocal Psychosis as a working diagnosis. I would also, as part of that rule out, continue to say, but as a provisional, this case should be continued to be worked up as a case of schizophrenia, which is exactly what we're doing this morning. Any other concerns about any other substance use beyond the norm, in that individuals who have used one substance certainly pose risk for polysubstance dependence. But beyond that, any evidence in the film that we need to delve into this any further?
We know that he smokes cigarettes, so we can assume it's nicotine. I mean, I guess it's possible it's laced with other things, but we do know that he has at least a nicotine dependence.
Definitely have to throw nicotine use disorder up in Axis 1 as well. We definitely do. And even though I don't think we'll have time to get to this morning, we had discussed this as part of our psychopharmacology lecture. His use of nicotine, I believe, is central to understanding the plot development and narrative of The Shining, in as much as nicotine or tobacco can interact with antipsychotics. And why Jack's exacerbation occurs is likely a drug-to-drug interaction between tobacco and the antipsychotic he was taking at the Overlook Hotel. Again, that's the details of which really are provided in a separate lecture on psychopharm. With regard to an underlying medical condition, any overt evidence in this script that Jack has an Axis 3?
So I think that you could make the case that when he's looking blankly, he might be seizing. So there might be some like temporal lobe epilepsy or something, but he doesn't really have like tonic-clonic jerking. So I'm not sure if like temporal lobe is correct, but like that should be considered.
But definitely, absolutely. And the fact that he does it, and the fact that his son has an episode of syncope prior to their leaving for the Overlook, suggests that there might be even a familial syndrome that would include seizures as part of its triad or its symptom set, which is itself concerning. Because
Yeah,
we see,
yeah, his son, he has many blank stares as well, so it might be some sort of seizure.
yeah, I think we have to include seizure disorder or epilepsy in Axis 3, or at least, I mean, at the very least, rule out. And similar to the pediatrician, needing to refer Danny to a continuous EEG. Jack Torrance as well would benefit from a 24-hour continuous EEG. Unfortunately, I don't think he's going to get that anytime soon. But epilepsy, definitely. Rule out epilepsy, axis 3. Anything else?
I was just going to say, time to call on Dr. Rishti. She's a wonderful epilepsy specialist at Robert Wood, who we rotate with on neuro.
Get her on that snowcat. Let her co-pilot with Dick, and get Jack some help. I'm not sure. I'm not so sure what she's gonna be able to do for Torrance up there, but absolutely. This is a much needed evaluation.
I guess another
All right.
thought might be like a traumatic brain injury secondary to his alcoholism, like if he blacked out or had some type of head trauma, maybe like do a CAT scan.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that he would get a CT with the EEG here. Yep. It would have been interesting if Kubrick gave us some focal deficits, but you know what? You can't ask for everything. Is there a significant mood component with regard to the character of Jack Torrance? If your answer is no, if this group's consensus is no, we can then move on from a primary mood disorder with psychotic features as well as schizoaffective disorder. However, if this group's consensus is yes, we would need to keep those two diagnoses in our differential diagnosis.
Yeah, there's definitely some mood component there. He's very angry, very labile, very easily irritable. So I think that we have to keep schizoaffective on the differential.
I agree. And somebody mentioned before there's difficulty with sleeping. That certainly could be a decreased need for sleep. He does demonstrate some manic signs, and I agree. I think we need to keep both a primary mood disorder as well as schizoaffective in our differential. And then finally, there is evidence in Jack's history of an autism spectrum disorder. A, yes. B, no. C, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter for him
And the reason why it doesn't matter?
because he has other positive symptoms like delusions and hallucinations, not just deficits in communication.
Exactly right. Right. So those overlapping symptoms between schizophrenia and an ASD are irrelevant here because Jack certainly demonstrates additional symptoms that would allow us to continue to formulate schizophrenia as the most likely diagnosis. Good. All right. Well, at this point in our differential, the next step would be that mental exercise that if we took notes on this film and we began to cross off all of our notes that were readily explained by everything we've just discussed, would there be anything left on your notes page? Is there anything that you observed that is yet unexplained or unaccounted for? Because if your answer is yes, we need to continue with our case formulation because we have to come up with reasons explaining what we observed that is unexplained up to this point. I think there's one biggie that jumps out at me. Anybody? And I think the general idea here is that in a vacuum, I think things are working somewhat linearly for us. I think we should be comfortable where we are in our case formulation. But I mean, I can't ignore the fact that Danny is suffering here too. And ultimately, Wendy suffers as well. And if we case formulate The Shining as a fictional case of schizophrenia in Jack Torrance, to not focus on the other characters, or when we do focus on the other characters, work them up for a mental illness that is somehow independent from Jack's experience doesn't feel quite right. We would have to think of a common variable, right? So certainly some type of exposure, maybe a toxin in the overlook would be a consideration here. Gets back to a substance-induced psychotic disorder. Remember, substances can be drugs, could be medications, could be herbs, could be toxins, including environmental toxins. And the overlook is old. And from that perspective, and especially with regard to the metaphor on it being cursed, I think we need to investigate that a little bit. And that would account for why Jack is not the only person to get sick. And the type of illness that we're describing in Jack seems to be characterized in the other two main characters in this movie as well. So that's something to consider. Any other observations here?
With Jack or the other characters?
On Jack, with
Yeah.
Jack. Maybe
I
one
just have to
more.
say,
and,
I think,
go ahead.
oh, sorry, Dr. Toby. The problem with Zoom is I feel like I overtalk over people, but Jack Nicholson brilliantly played this role. I mean, I think he's such a brilliant actor, so you just have to give a shout out to him.
Oh, great. I think this role was made for him. But the other observation here is a lot of the things that you would find on the internet with regard to a deep dive into this movie and whether we could make sense of any or all of those. I mean, every time, and one of the reasons why we use this film to discuss psychopathology is that every time you watch the film, I mean, it sounds cliche, but you really do pick up on something that perhaps you hadn't before. And all of those intricacies are vintage Kubrick. They're clearly intended and worthy of discussion, especially to the point that they're just not explained by anything we discussed up to this point. So that's just something to consider too. Now, I do want to bring a couple of them up as an example in terms of what I mean. But suffice it to say that there's such a multitude here that even if we had an entire day, we likely would not be able to cover them or exhaust that search. We really wouldn't. So any observations, anybody have some fun? Anybody actually go down that rabbit hole and want to discuss anything about The Shining as a film that, again, that is just vintage to this film and really what this film has become to be known for.
I was briefly reading online that the Stanley Kubrick deviated from the book in terms of the ending, like in terms of Jack dying versus living. So I thought that was interesting in terms of a stylistic choice from Stanley Kubrick.
And I think when an author does that, and by the way, just a quick heads up, a small derailment. We're having a group watch tonight of Field of Dreams. If you contact David or Annette, actually Annette, she could give you the link. The reason why we're having a group watch tonight, 7 p.m. Field of Dreams, is because a week from today, we're having the author, the director of Field of Dreams, join us in a special lecture, right? So I think everybody here knows that. So Phil Robinson's going to join us, and he's going to co-host an event a week from today. That will also be at 7 p.m. When Phil Robinson was emailing me back and forth, one of the things he focused on was that the author of the novel Field of Dreams, Ray Kinsella, thanked him for all the creative liberty that Phil took in directing that movie. Evidently, the film starring Kevin Costner deviates significantly from the novel. And one of the things I want to discuss with Phil a week from today is why he did what he did. What was the motivation behind it? Because the answer that he's going to provide, and I have no idea what they are. I really don't. I don't know what scenes he added, and I don't know why he added them. But I will say this: the ultimate answer is sublimation. Phil did what he did to sublimate an impulse that was forbidden to come to conscious expression. That's the bottom line here. And I'm very interested to learn what those scenes are that were added and get his perspective or insight as to why he did that. Because the author of the book, the novel, was like incredibly thankful for all the creative liberty that Phil took in directing that movie. And Phil, the reason why he's joining us a week from today is because he was as grateful and really enthusiastic that we took further creative liberty and used his movie to teach psychiatry. He thought that was an incredible experience. He actually saw our live stream and just thought that this was a replay of exactly what he did himself, bringing the text to life on the screen. The same is not true. Well, the same is, but isn't true with regard to The Shining. Kubrick does what he does. He takes all this creative liberty, including the ending, for a reason. And we're about to discuss one example, the ending. Where this does not hold up is that unlike Phil Robinson, the author, excuse me, I should say, not like Ray Kinsella, the author, Stephen King, the author of The Shining, was not grateful and had zero gratitude for Kubrick doing what he did. King felt that his work, called or titled The Shining, the novel, was destroyed. And he didn't think that writer-producer should take as much creative liberty. He thought that he should have the say in that and not Stanley Kubrick. And the two never talked again, right? So an interesting twist there. But it does get us to the ending, because the ending significantly departs from the final pages of the novel. In the novel, we actually see something that is quite consistent with our provisional diagnosis of schizophrenia, and perhaps even supportive of schizophrenia as the most likely diagnosis, and that is that Jack Torrance becomes so disorganized that he is unable to perform his most menial and core tasks as the caretaker of the Overlook. And he continually forgets to check the furnace. And as a result, the furnace combusts and the Overlook burns to the ground, killing Jack Torrance in the fire. Again, that would be consistent with someone who has chronic schizophrenia or an acute exacerbation of schizophrenia, not being able to provide executive functioning, planning, and performing those very tasks. On the other hand, the ending of the movie is, spoiler alert, Danny Torrance killing his father. Danny Torrance goes into that hedge maze, and Jack, stalking him, going after him, is unable to find his way out of that maze. This is an allusion to the Minotaur in Greek mythology. So the question then becomes, well, why did Kubrick do that? And now with his passing, we'll never know. But what could this group impart on that departure from the novel, in as much as it might actually contribute to case formulation? Any thoughts? General idea is that we are taking some creative liberty in overly focusing on how the ending of the movie departs from the ending of the book. And we're trying to think through, why did Kubrick do that? What was Kubrick trying to relay to us? Especially us as a group of psychiatrists.
I think one thought might be that if we're going back to the idea of like a substance-induced like intoxication, that the hotel kind of consumed him and he would go down with the hotel, and that the hotel is like a demonic victim. And then there's the scene at the end with the photo, like all the prior victims who have been consumed by the hotel.
And actually, I want to expand a little bit on the photo in a sec as well. Kubrick is telling us that there is value, that there is a message in that hedge maze, because that ending does not exist in the book. So Kubrick's intent here, as far as we're concerned, is that there's something about that hedge maze that we as a group of psychiatrists need to understand to make sense of the case study of Jack Torrance. So a couple things here. Number one, the furnace kills Jack Torrance in the novel again, and we get Jack's inability to perform his basic duties. Again, consistent with schizophrenia. It's not the case in the movie. The case to be made in the movie is that Danny Torrance plays an active role in Jack's death, in that hedge maze, in that labyrinth. Why would Danny Torrance do that? Danny Torrance does that because his father is sexually molesting him. And there is significant evidence throughout this entire film that Jack Torrance not only physically abused Danny, but sexually abused him as well. And once you understand that, you can then look back on that scene when Jack tells, I believe it's Lloyd, that he is no longer physically abusing Danny. In a way, he's not lying, but he's not telling the full truth either. Because while he may no longer be physically abusing Danny, he continues to sexually molest him. And there's evidence of this with regard to watching very closely when Jack is in the Overlook at the time of his initial interview. Anybody know what I'm referring to there? What magazine is Jack Torrance reading as he's waiting for Ullman to come out to get him? It's Playgirl. And what's the title on that issue of Playgirl? I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know it verbatim. And I usually at this point would say something to the effect of, I'll post a pic of it on Instagram. I'm not going to post a pic of it on Instagram. One of the titles with regard to articles in that issue is Why Parents Have Sex with Their Children. So there's overt evidence here with regard to why Danny kills Jack at the end of the film, The Shining. So this all again informs our differential diagnosis in Jack Torrance. Substance use disorder, psychosis, rule out Wernicke's Korsakoff syndrome versus schizophrenia, and now pedophilic disorder. That's the case formulation of Jack. Any other deep dives here? Let's talk about that photo. We have about 5 or so minutes left. What's the meaning of that picture? Well, at the very end of this movie, the final scene tracks down the Great Hall and then focuses on a picture from I believe it's the 1927 New Year's, 4th of July ball. It's either 21 or 27. The date's irrelevant. And we see in the middle of that picture is what looks like a young Jack Torrance. And how do we interpret that? Well, one conspiracy theory is that the haunting of the Overlook results in a doppelganger syndrome, and that there are 2 Jack Torrances. And it's interesting that there's some evidence to support this. Number one, when the Torrances first move in on closing day, the scene, I believe, is the family walking with Ullman from right to left. And as they do, in the background, there is another Jack Torrance, albeit with his back to you. And that Jack Torrance is actually wearing the red jacket that he will wear later when he goes to that ballroom and talks to the bartender. So there's an idea that this hotel somehow duplicates reality. This is further supported with regard to the character, or maybe plural characters, of Grady. Do you remember the conversation that Jack, in the interview, has with Ullman when Ullman discloses to him the sinister history and what happened at the Overlook with regard to a former caretaker?
Yeah, didn't the former caretaker also chop up his family or kill the family?
Exactly right. And that caretaker's name was Charles Grady. When Jack meets, quote unquote, a ghost when he suffers from visual hallucinations at that ball, and the waiter spills something on his jacket and they have to go to the restroom to get off the stain. What's the name of that character?
Is that not
It's
Charles Grady as well?
It's
it's
a different,
Delbert Grady.
first name.
Oh.
Delbert Grady. Stanley Kubrick would not have made that mistake. Stanley Kubrick would not have made that mistake. He would not have written that script and forgot the name of the caretaker alluded to by Ullman in the scene prior. There are two Gradys. Relevance here with regard to a group of psychiatrists. This is a very rare condition in which someone suffering from psychosis believes that there are two realities. Anybody remember the name of this syndrome? It's called reduplicative paramnesia.
That's just what I was going to say, Dr. Tobia.
Yeah, that was on the tip of my tongue. Yeah.
That's it. Now, unfortunately for us, The Shining being about reduplicative paramnesia does not shed any further light as to whether or not that's a syndrome within the context of schizophrenia or a syndrome within the context of a Corsocal psychosis. It really doesn't help differentiate, but it certainly would be part of our case formulation. So that's The Shining, formulated as a fictional case through the eyes of its main character, Jack Torrance. We're right up against the top of the hour. Any final comments or thoughts?
Would you mind just giving the interpretation of Danny and Tony, like how are they linked and stuff, or
Yeah,
is
you
it
know,
like from abuse and yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I agree. So I think when we first hear about Tony, we tend to agree with the pediatrician that children have imaginary friends. We also know that this family recently moved from New England and is looking forward to move again into the Overlook. Certainly two situations that a young boy like Danny probably would deem unfavorable. He has difficulty acclimating to his new school. I think that's teased out certainly more in the novel than it is the movie. The bottom line here is that Danny's imaginary friend is likely to continue past the range that we would usually deem to be developmentally appropriate. Right? So there's stuff going on in the home here. And then you add in the physical abuse, you add in the sexual abuse, and we have a really good understanding now as to why Danny has an imaginary friend. And an imaginary friend at an age where imaginary friends really tend to cease, right? Again, there's no hard stop there. And certainly Danny could continue for another 3 or 4 years. And I don't think it's going to result in a hospitalization. That said, imaginary friends, number one, do not result in syncope. So I'm not sure what the pediatrician is thinking when she reassures Wendy, but the house call was after Danny passes out and is unconscious. And by the way, during that call, that is that house call, Danny has his hands over his genitals the whole time. So there's evidence that there's something going on that the pediatrician is absolutely missing and missing observing as well. And over Danny's right shoulder is a teddy bear. We're not going to have time for it this morning, but certainly at some point, perhaps when we meet again, remind me to tell you how that teddy bear connects to that iconic scene of the bear man performing fellatio at the end of this movie, because those two are connected. Right? Again, that's a deep dive, but they are connected. The other thing about this imaginary friend is that no imaginary friend should ever take over the conscious awareness of the boy. And that's exactly what happens. Danny dissociates. And when he is awake, alert, and oriented thereafter, he has amnesia with regard to Tony's having taken over his conscious awareness. So there's evidence of not only dissociation, but at this young age, perhaps even DID, either of which would be the consequence of severe trauma. When Jack does what he does with his son, Danny is not consciously there. And the person, the alter ego that takes over Danny's conscious awareness during the abuse is named Tony. And I think that's the evolution and that's the etiology of his quote unquote imaginary friend. I think it's much, much more complex than an imaginary friend. And that complexity begins not only with maybe some age inappropriateness with regard to development, but also there are signs and symptoms associated with Tony, syncope, that no imaginary friend should carry. And number two, that imaginary friend actually taking over Danny's conscious awareness. All right, we're right up at 9 o'clock. Good discussion. And we have something planned for next month?
Well, next week, me and Danielle are doing a segment on The Shining.
Yep. If you have an idea and you're already following through with it, wonderful. If you have some opening or to discuss further, let me know, because I could certainly add in some of these deep dives in terms of going there.
We can do more deep dive. For me, I was going to go through a quick paper.
Yep. Let me know. Just let me know if you want to set up a quick 30-minute discussion. We can do a couple of deep dives, discuss how they relate back to diagnosing here, and that would include the infamous bear man scene as well.
Okay, sounds
Good
good.
discussion, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr.
Thanks,
Tobia.
Dr. Tobia.